Hey guys, Janice here, and I have the video. I'm bringing you a new book this week. So cool, so groovy. Anyway, before we get started with that, let's just remember our shop. Groovy stuff in our shop, man. So much groovy stuff in our shop. Lots of books, lots of writing services, lots of pretty things over on the Redbubble store. Go check it out, support us, and while you're doing that, or just while you're watching, why don't you drop us a like or a subscribe? It really helps us out, you know, man? Yeah. Okay, so our video for this week, our book for this week, actually it's going to be two books, and I'll explain why as we go through why it's actually two books, but it's partly because one book makes a lot more sense when you look at the other as well. But the book we are having a look at is the classic, I guess. It's a little penguin, man. It's an orange penguin, so I guess it's a classic now. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey. I bet you've all seen the film. I haven't seen the film. It's not really my jam. But I have read the book. And so that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about the film anyway. So there you go. So, before we get any further, Antonisha, third favorite fall stuff, finally saw Orson Welles. Second favorite fall stuff. There you go. Anyway, we're doing One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Okay, this was published in the early 60s, I think about 64. And it tells the story of this ward in a mental hospital. Ken Kesey's background is really important for understanding why this book is set in a mental hospital. Okay, Ken Kesey wrote this at 24. Keep that in mind. He wrote this at 24. After having taken part in the American government hallucinogenic experimentation thing that was happening in the late 50s, early 60s. Okay, so the American government wanted to see whether psychoactive chemicals, what they did, and whether they could create a super soldier. Turns out you can't create a super soldier off LSD. Won't work. No way, no how. LSD don't work like that. So Ken Kesey was part of this government experiment on what happened with LSD. I think LSD might be the thing to take that would absolutely destroy your chances of having a good soldier. The effects of it appear to negate whatever the American government was after. And the experiments got closed down because psychoactive compounds were not producing the effects that they wanted, which is a super soldier type of effects. What they produce are stoned hippies. But they didn't know that then. So Ken Kesey was part of this experiment and took a lot of LSD. And when we're talking LSD, we're talking the real deal, the really hard to make 60s LSD. The stuff, the real deal. It's a very hard chemical compound to create. I don't think 60s LSD does not exist anymore. Is incredibly hard to make. There was one guy who made 1 million doses. He was like the LSD king. But you want to hear an interesting of not LSD psychoactives is Pete Townshend's discussion of how he came up with Tommy, and the bad trip he had there. Anyway, that's beside the point. Ken Kesey was taking part in the government experiments with LSD. So he was, and this was actually at this mental hospital. They were doing these. So he was part of this experiment. He then later got a job on the ward of the same mental hospital for a little while, and his observations of the mentally ill people on the ward formulated his thesis, which is behind this book. Okay? He is 24 years old and he has had an awful lot of LSD. Okay? So, this book takes place in a psychiatric ward of a big hospital. The narrator is the chief, a Native American man who is believed to be a deaf mute. He is, and he lives in the ward. He is a man who's been involuntarily committed, so he can't leave. He ain't leaving this place. And he tells this story. So instantly, and I don't know why this seems to never really come up in terms of the way people read this, a lot of the readings of this book. He's not a reliable narrator. Of all the narrators that you could possibly meet, this is probably the least reliable narrator that you will ever meet. His attachment to reality is tenuous at best. Tenuous. So, onto his ward, which is ruled by the big nurse, Nurse Ratchet, who she's the head nurse on the ward, and she is a former army nurse. So she's a woman for whom, this is the early 1960s, this is not a woman who has got married and had kids, because that would not be possible for her to do that and be in the position she has. This is a woman who has made nursing, and it appears at this point in her career, psychiatric nursing, her life. That's what she does. She is a career nurse. From the army to the psychiatric ward, she's a career nurse, and she runs the ward. She runs the ward. We very rarely see doctors. Most of the interface between the patients and the system is between Nurse Ratchet, other nurses, and orderlies. You don't see doctors on the ward very often. So into this world, into this ordered world, comes McMurphy. McMurphy is an inmate from the local prison. He's on work detail, and this will become ironic when I talk about the next one. He's on work detail, and he has decided that it's much easier to spend the rest of his sentence in the psychiatric hospital than doing work detail, and so he's going to pretend to be mad. Now, Kesey sees McMurphy, and a lot of other readings of this book see McMurphy as a trickster god, a Loki come in, as something that disrupts order. And this read straight, McMurphy is a really disturbing character. Now, McMurphy does come in, the ward does get messed up, things go crazy, they do go crazy in their world. They're ordered, sensible, quiet, safe, safe, genuinely safe. This is Nurse Ratched might not be a barrel of laughs, but she is keeping a group of incredibly vulnerable people, for the most part, safe. The majority of these people that we meet in this novel are voluntarily at the hospital. They are not like Chief and they're not like Murphy. They're not being committed. They're voluntarily at the hospital. They are people who have said, my mental issues are so grave that in the 1950s, 60s, I have put my hand up and said, I need help. That means these are people who are incredibly vulnerable and who are suffering, who have been suffering to the point where, you know what, drinking it and suppressing it is no longer cutting it for me. I'm suffering that much. This is a world where men, especially, these are men. This is a world where men did not put their hand up and say, I need help. So this is an incredibly vulnerable community. An incredibly vulnerable community. And McMurphy comes in and messes the whole system up completely, because he's the liberating human spirit, blah, 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 blah. But what you have is an outsider coming in and thinking, oh, none of your problems are that big. It's just because you're all being controlled. You're being this, you're being... I was like, oh, this so reads like a 24-year-old who's had way too much acid. Of course you think that this person's intractable depression or this person's whatever, this person's schizophrenia, this person's incredible trauma, because it becomes pretty apparent from what we hear of Chief's life. He's gone deep into himself out of trauma. I mean, we would now understand that a lot more than someone like Kesey, that the trauma of being a indigenous person in a colonial country, an indigenous person in cut off from culture, language, everything. Yeah, that's going to cause trauma. This is a traumatized man who is retreated into silence. And he actually says he's retreated into silence. So McMurphy comes and messes up the whole everything. He butts head with Nurse Ratched. Now, Nurse Ratched, we see her from Chief's perspective. And we see her from a male perspective. Because until you get to the end, until you get to the very, very end, and I will not defend what she says to Billy, because she, like much of a 1950s, early 1960s world, did not seem to see the difference between just something as a breaking a societal rule versus actual crimes and misdemeanors. Like, this is a world that punished pregnancy outside of marriage. Like, when you look at what happened to unwed mothers in this period, this is a world that punished misdemeanors, societal indiscretions in a way similar to crime. So yes, what she says and the shaming of Billy at the end is not on. It's not cool. But it would never have happened without the chaotic McMurphy coming in and treating what had been a previously safe place like his own personal pleasure garden to mess up. So until that point, the only thing you can say about Nurse Ratched is She's not feminine. She's not sexual. The men don't desire her. She's in a position of authority over them, a position that she would have had to work very hard to achieve. That she is a product of her time, that she does follow the rules of her society that are imposed upon her and expects other people to follow them. These are things that do not make a great and evil person. Now, while I will not defend what she says to Billy at the end of the novel, there is very little else in the novel that is actually under her control. She is seen as control because she is the biggest, most powerful interface they have with the rest of the hospital. But she doesn't prescribe drugs. She doesn't prescribe any treatment. That comes from the psychiatrists, the doctors prescribe theirs. But because she is the one who has to administer those, she is the villain in terms of this. Now, the end of the novel, which I read this a long while ago, and then I had another look at it while preparing for this, and especially the end and what happens to what McMurphy does after we hear that Billy has killed himself in the doctor's office waiting for the psychiatrist, and she does two things that you can be pretty sure she probably blames herself for the rest of her life. One is over-shaming Billy. Second one is leaving him in the office with no one. Because she immediately sends, when the doctor comes down, to send him to Billy. So she is concerned enough that she doesn't want to leave him unattended to. The chaos here, we'll deal with the chaos here, but please go and deal with Billy. So she's not a monster. The doctor is actually the one who's going to get hung out to dry for this. Because the hospital actually suggests, we'll accept your resignation. And he's like, no, you can fire me. She comes back to work. So clearly he's higher up. The hospital's decided, no, this is your little circus. You with the big title and the big salary. You're actually the one who we're going to blame for this. But the patients all see the nurse as the villain. It doesn't actually mean that's the reality of things. Remember, we have an unreliable narrator. And when McMurphy attacks her, he beats her. He beats her so badly that she is a week away from the hospital, away from the ward, and in another part of the hospital. And when she returns, she can't speak, and her face is still swollen. So she has absolutely been beaten. But more than that, and the thing that actually stood out in a way that I think the first time I read it, because I came to it with the already preconceived idea of, I know this story, this is the villain, is when McMurphy beats her, he tears her uniform open and exposes her breasts. And all of a sudden, the men see her as, and the description of her breasts is like, oh my God. Simply because it's so, it's almost like she becomes naughty nurse to the men. It's she's suddenly sexualized, and by being sexualized, she can be diminished because her ability to run the ward after she returns is diminished. her authority is diminished because now she is just a woman. Had he just beaten her, that would have been to treat her as a man. But to expose her body and to sexualize her in that way is absolutely an act to put her in her place. And the fact that that is, I've not seen commentary on that, or the fact that she is still viewed as like the most evil villain in the book by many, many people is quite interesting. As it's interesting, it's very much it's a very misogynistic attitude to take. It also, this book being so incredibly well known is probably not a good thing, because it is not a good representation of psychiatric care. It's certainly not a good representation of modern practices. I mean, when this was written, psychiatrists would do electroshock therapy in the back room without sedatives or muscle relaxants or painkillers. Okay, Sylvia Plath experienced that and was terrified of it. This is still a world of lobotomies. I mean, that was just a plain barbaric practice. Barbaric, and with zero actual scientific backing behind it. It appears to have been like one guy's hobby horse. And it was a widespread practice, which is disturbing, deeply disturbing. But from a perspective of this is in a mental hospital, and the patients in a mental hospital, there's nothing wrong with them. They should all be free. They're just nonconformist, is very much coming from Ken Kesey's own attitudes and the massive amount of acid. So I will say be wary of it in reading it just straight, because just straight, this has some seriously disturbing elements, and certainly does not reflect the reality of people's lives with mental illness and the suffering that goes along with intractable, difficult to treat mental illness, which the men in this ward are clearly suffering from. Read in a different way, I would still, in spite of all of that, I would still say that this is a worthwhile book. Because this is an example of a very rare genre, rare genre, which is an acid novel. Ken Kesey equates the hallucination of mental illness with an acid trip. And so the chief's narration is an acid trip. Now, I told you we were going to have a look at two books to understand this. Second book we're having a look at to help understand this is Tom Wolfe's book, The Electric Kool-aid Acid Test. So if you wondered what happened to Ken Kesey after this book, because there is precious little else that he wrote. He wrote another novel, but it was like really weirdly sort of Ayn Rand type politics. It's nothing like this book. But he's written very little else. What did he do after this book came out? Because this was massively popular. It was massively popular. It became a play, then it became a film. So he was fined for money. They formed the Merry Pranksters. So this is in the mid-60s, the beginning of the counterculture movement, about 64, I think. And he and a group of other people got on a bus. They called themselves the Merry Pranksters. They got on a bus, went around America, giving people acid. Not always with their knowledge or consent or full understanding, which is really bad, because lysergic acid, at the point where he was using it in this novel, where it was being used in this novel, was an extremely new experimental drug. At this point, it had not been criminalized. This was not, what they were doing was not technically dosing people with an illicit substance in terms of, it was not criminalized. I mean, George Harrison and John Lennon were dosed with lysergic acid by their wives, by one of their dentists, without being told, and then went out to a club, and it was very weird. But there appeared to have been a culture of people being able to get a hold of lysergic acid and then dosing each other. Yeah, that's a great way to fly out a window on a third story. No, seriously. And the Merry Pranksters went around dosing people with lysergic acid. They also had happenings, the Electric Kool-aid Acid Tests, at which the house band of the Electric Kool-aid Acid Test were the Warlocks, who became the Grateful Dead. This was East Coast counterculture as opposed to, no, this was West Coast counterculture as opposed to East Coast counterculture, which is Timothy Leary. And they took a more, academic, scientific approach. Timothy Leary and Ken Kesey did not get along. Whereas Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters had a more whirly-durly, just devil-may-care, dose people at big events type of thing. Acid, you can't sleep acid off. You need to live it out. I don't actually know this from experience, but from what I've read, it's if you've been dosed with acid and you didn't know what's happened to you, that sounds incredibly scary. There is footage of this. It's called Magic Bus. I have it. If you want to be sick, watch it. It's a lot of handheld camera work from people, and a lot of people walking around doing all sorts of things on acid. Watching people on acid is like watching stoned toddlers. Like, it's like your cat on the best nip it's ever had. Just, whoa. You can see colors. But that's what he was doing. This is an acid book. The ideas in this, the ideas of conformity, of rebellion against conformity, that's what he wrote this, and then he went and put that into practice. The hospital ward is not the hospital ward. The hospital ward is the world. The conformity is the conformity of a world that cannot tell the difference between a crime and a misdemeanor. The McMurphy is what would become the Merry Pranksters. As you can imagine, the authorities were not terribly pleased with the Merry Pranksters going around and dosing people with lysergic acid. And Ken Kesey got done, I think, twice for marijuana and had to go and join a work camp. But he wasn't stupid enough to go and pretend to be mad and get himself locked up. He just did his time in a work camp. But it's an acid book. This is by Tom Wolfe. It's actually a really good piece of long-form, more or less long-form journalism, sort of like Hunter S. Thompson type of thing. It's more... It's a very 60s book. It's a very 60s book. They're both very 60s books. But if you want a sense of the utter chaos that occurs when you put a whole bunch of people on acid on a bus, except for the driver took speed. So a speedy driver and some acid head passengers on a bus dosing people with acid and then getting in trouble with the cops, that's your book. This book, I would say, is definitely best read as a metaphor or an analogy for the wider world. Please do not look at it and think this is what mental health looks like, for the love of God. I think sadly too many people have, and it has caused a lot of negative attitudes around mental health care, and the assumption that seeking that kind of help or needing that kind of help results in like a cuckoo's nest ward. Please don't look at it like that. It is more a metaphor for the world of conformity, the 50s world, the straight-laced world that the counterculture of the 60s will break open and change. So I would say read this because of what it is. You don't find that many acid books. They're just that rare. But read it with this also. Read this as a companion piece to it, because I think it gives you a very different perspective. I definitely read this straight until I read this. Read straight, this has some really disturbing concepts, and certainly the misogyny is really disturbing. But read as an acid book, read in combination with this, it moderates that to a certain degree. Anyway, that's it from me. So I'll be back again sometime later with another book. And until then, peace and love, guys. Peace and love. If you would like to support this channel, come across to the Black Cockie Press website, www.blackcockiepress.com.au, where you will find books and other writing services to help with your writing.